All right, so up to this point, we've been looking at how to map state that is maintained by the store, mapping it to properties that the components are expecting. Yes? Right. So up to this point, the data has been flowing one way, right? The data flows from the store, goes to the provider, through the container, down to the component. Okay. How about the other way around? As users interact with the application, they generate a stream of events, actions, right? So those actions presumably would have to be reduced by the reducer or handled by the reducer so that it can calculate what the next state should be. Right? So let's take a look at how do we handle events. So the first one is, let's do a really, really trivial click event that is being generated by our low-level component. Right? Our component is right now is just saying hello, right? Whatever the state says. And so again, our components, right? Just like they're not going to be responsible for maintaining any of the state, they're not going to be responsible for handling any of the events, right? The responsibility of calculating the next state is going to be completely handled by the reducer. So it will also be responsible for handling any events that the user generates, right? So the glue between these events, right, is also going to be through properties. Right? Notice that up to this point, we've been using properties only to feed data into a component for rendering, yes? But we could also feed it a function as an argument as well, right? And so that function could be then used as a callback function, so that when you do an on-click on a button, we can call that function handle click, right? So let's do that. Let's move this over here. So let's go down to our hello component and wrap this into an H1 here. Okay, so we're going to pass in a function here. We're going to pass it as an argument. It says the hello click, or what did I call it? Handle click. Handle click. So the only thing that the component is going to say is notify us that an event happened, but it's not going to be its responsibility to manage the event. So we're going to put a button here that says button and click me, and this is going to have an on click, and it's going to pass as an argument the handle click. Notice the syntax here. The syntax is very important. If the function is just going to be invoked, then we can use this syntax. On click is tied to this function, meaning when the click happens, that function will be invoked. If I need to pass arguments, if I need to pass something to the function, yes, careful with just doing this and putting these parentheses like that. Because what this will cause is an infinite loop, right? That is going to instantiate the object, it's going to generate an event, it's going to that cause render again the object, it's going to call again, it's going to get into an infinite loop. So careful, right? If you need to pass arguments, you need to wrap this inside of a function. You need to wrap it inside of a function. If you need to do some calculation before you invoke the function, then you would use a full expression, right? Where you do an actual curly brackets and you can do, do something here. Yes, right? But if you are just invoking the function and you don't need to pass anything, we can just be lazy, right, and use this very terse syntax of just passing it the function. Yes? Everybody good? All right. All right, so who's providing that function? Who's providing that function? Well, if you remember, I mentioned earlier that the container, right, this connect function takes two arguments, right? So the first argument maps the data coming from the state and it maps it into the properties of the component, right? The second argument maps the data going backwards. It maps the events that are being generated by the component and it sends them up to the reducer, right? So that the reducer can handle those events. Remember, our components, our containers are not going to handle anything anymore, right? Everything's going to be done by the reducer, right? So we need to do the plumbing both ways, right? How do we extract the data from the reducer down to the component, and how do we extract events that are being generated by the React components and then send them back to the reducer. And then the reducer will take both things. It will take the state, it will take the events, right? And it will implement the state machine and says, okay, what state am I in? What are the events? Here's a new state. Make sense? Right? All right, so let's do the plumbing now. We need to do the connection of this property, this handle click event property, right, back up to the component, back up to the reducer. So let's do that. So to do that, right, we know that the reducer is going to want to handle this. Is going to want to handle this. So let's do that. Let's go back to our reducer. Our reducer right now is too trivial, right? It's not doing much, not doing anything. It's always calculating the same state. That's not very interesting. So the reducer actually can take two arguments here. It can take as argument the current state, right, and an action, the event. And then in here, this function is basically the implementation of a finite state machine. Right, I'm going to look at the old event. Where am I? What's the current state? And when I'm looking at the action, and depending on the action, I'm going to generate the next state. I'm going to return different things. Everybody good? All right, so let's do that. So here, instead of always return the same thing over and over and over, what we're going to do is going to say, okay, well, I'm going to look at the action. And depending on the action, I will generate one state or another state. Right? So this is going to become one big switch statement that's going to look at the action. Going to look at the action, and depending on that action, it will transition to one state or the other. Okay, one big if statement. Right. So this action object that is being passed as an argument has to follow a particular structure. This action needs to have a particular schema, right? The requirement is that the action object that is being passed here has to have at least one attribute called the type attribute. The type is going to be our edges in the finite state machine, right? If you have a finite state machine, you have different state, yes, and you have edges that transition from one state to the next, right? Right. So those edges usually have a very well defined name or token, right? That the user added something to the shopping cart, the user removed something from the shopping cart, the user wants to look at the total of the shopping cart, whatever, right? What they want to navigate to the checkout. So all those events, right, are the edges that transition between our states. Yes, and that is represented here by the type. This is the only required attribute in the action object, right? And then we have a whole bunch of cases. We're going to compare the type against all sorts of options. Option one or action one, right? Then if it's action one, we do something. If it's action two, we do something else. We can have any number of actions. Okay, it may be a default at the end, and the default might be that we just return this here. Okay, and these typically might have a whole bunch of breaks. Right, so the action one will be, I don't know, add something to the shopping cart, remove something from the shopping cart, change the quantity of the shopping cart, things like that. Yes, all the different actions that the user can take. And you can have a default. If I don't know what you're telling me to do, I'll just give you something, or maybe I'll give you the current state. The very common thing to do is that by default is to just give you the same state that you were in, meaning don't change state. If I don't know what you're asking me to do, well, then just stay in the state that you're in. Yes? Right? So what we could do here is that I'm just going to return the state. I'm just going to return the current state. And say I'm going to return the state. return the state. So that means that somehow I need to have an initial state. What is my initial state? Right, the initial state might be const initial state, might be some JSON object, right? And then we can say that the state is equal to this initial state, right? It's equal to that initial state, right? If we go back, hopefully this still works. Return the message of undefined. Did I miss something? Switch. Wait, did I miss something? Return, blah, blah, blah. Message, action, click, action type, return state, initial state, message, const. Well, let me make, maybe this is not being initialized. Const, let's see. All right. So it wasn't being initialized somehow. All right, I'll get back to that in a minute. But there it is. So we have the same thing. Basically, this our function is being invoked. It type actually doesn't have a value, so it's not equal to that. It's not equal to that. It's not equal to that. So it's equal to just the current state, right? And for now, the initial value of the state function of the state variable is that our initial what we had earlier. Yes, right. So nothing has changed so far. Okay. All right. So let's look at the example here. So here, what we're gonna have it. What we'd like to be able to do is that when we click on that button in the hello world component, we would like to send a message back to our reducer that the user clicked on this button. Okay. Right. So we're gonna call that somehow. We need to generate this action object. Somehow we need to generate this action object, and we need to pass in some data here of some type. So we can call it something, what we want to call it. So when we call it a click or hello click or something, whatever we want. This is something that means to us. This is something that the developer, they come up and says, well, what do you want to call this event that transitions from this state to the next, right? And let's and what we'd like to be able to do it maybe is send some other state. Instead of saying hello from reducer, maybe we want to return something else. Maybe we want to return some other state that says goodbye from reducer. And so that would be the next state. Yes? So by default is hello. And well, we don't really need the break because we're just returning. Okay. So somehow we need to generate that action with that type equal to hello, click. So how do we do that? Right now we still have just so right now it's not doing anything. Right now it's not doing anything. Okay. All right, excellent. So how do we do that? How do we generate that? All right, so to do that, right, we need to map, right, this event that the component is generating through the property. We need to somehow dispatch it and generate an action that's going to be fed into the reducer. So the functions that generate this action are referred to as dispatcher in Redux speak, in Redux jargon. Just like the container has a state to property mapper, well, we're going to have a dispatcher, right, to property mapper that maps the events here, the functions, is going to map them to dispatchers that are going to generate these actions. Right? So let's do that. Right. So here it is. Now, just like we had a state to property mapper, we're going to have a dispatcher to property mapper. Right? Just like there's a state that's being provided by the provider, right? The provider also passes us a function that allows us to call back the reducer. Right? Not only does it pass us the state from the reducer, it also passes us a function, a generic function that we can call so that we can pass data back to the reducer. Right? And that function, we just invoke it, and the only thing that we need to pass it is an action object. Right? We can pass it and we can call the reducer with an action object. So let's do that. So let's go back to the container. Let's go back to that. So just like we had this state to property mapper, we're going to have a dispatcher to property mapper, right? But instead of the state coming from the reducer down to the component, this is a function that is going to allow us to invoke the reducer and pass it an action. Right? And so this is a dispatcher, and this is just another function that's going to return an object, just like we have a mapper here. It's going to map the properties that the component has, this handle click, just like the this one is mapping the properties down in the component. This one is going to map the function. Now this handle is not just any JSON object; is a function. It's a JavaScript function. JavaScript function, and here when you click on it, it's going to invoke whatever you give it here. What do we want to happen when we click on that button? We want to call the dispatcher, and we want to pass it a JSON object whose type is whatever the reducer is expecting. The reducer is expecting this hello click. It's looking at the type. This action is this JSON object. This action that's receiving here is whatever we're passing right here. And it's expecting that action to have a type. And the type will be the hello click here. Right? And finally, just to do the final connection here, is that we pass this into the connect. Right? I know this is a lot of plumbing and it's a lot of hurry. We'll need to do this over and over and over and over. And once you've done it 5, 6, 7, 10 times, it says, oh, I get it. All right. It takes a while. All right, let's go back here. Let's see if this is broken. And we click on the click. Notice that it changes. The states change. So that, right? Basically, what happens is that when I clicked here, the reducer gets called, the action gets passed in, the type is the type we wanted, and a new state is generated. And that new state gets down to the container. The container takes the state with the new state, right, and maps it to the property, and the property renders in the component. Make sense? All right. Again, a lot of plumbing. Right? A lot of plumbing. Hello, goodbye from reducer. Okay. All right. Excellent. What if we want to pass parameters? Right now, the parameter, we haven't passed any parameters, right? It's just this function that we're invoking. So how do we do that?